Welcome to the Baby Let's Talk podcast. My name is Ragna and I am your host. I am a medical doctor, a certified pre-postnatal trainer and a mother of 4, and I help moms reclaim their health and reach their goals through the power of movement, nutrition and overall healthy lifestyle. This podcast is born from my dedication to uncovering the truths about nutrition, exercise and lifestyle that genuinely benefit our bodies. We'll explore how to establish a lasting, healthy lifestyle that fits the reality of motherhood, how to enjoy an active, pain-free pregnancy, and how to navigate postpartum recovery to regain your fitness in a wholesome way. Join me as we debunk myths and discover the paths to excess energy, body confidence, and loving the life you live as a mom. Welcome to episode 3 of the Baby Let's Talk podcast. This is part 2 of the blood sugar series, and in this episode we will dive deeper into the world of blood glucose and insulin, and picking up from our last chat we'll explore how our bodies handle glucose and fatty acids and the intricacies of insulin's role in this process. And we'll also get quite technical at times to get a better understanding of how our bodies juggle all this stuff to keep us going, and how we should use this to our advantage to work with our body and not against it. So, in part 1 of the blood sugar series, we talked about what carbohydrates are, what happens in our body when we eat carbohydrates. We talked about blood glucose regulation and the hormones implicated in that, and also how this influences our body's energy balance. So, if you haven't listened to part 1 already, I suggest you do that before listening to this episode, as this episode is a direct continuation of part 1. But just a short recap of where we left off in the previous episode. So we talked about that the two main energy sources for energy production in our cells are glucose from carbohydrates and then fatty acids from fats. And when we eat carbohydrates, they are broken down in our digestive system to glucose and also to fructose and galactose, but mainly glucose. And then glucose is absorbed into our bloodstream, leading to an increased concentration of glucose in our blood. That is an increase in blood glucose levels or blood sugar levels. And increased concentration of glucose in the blood leads to then the secretion of the hormone insulin from beta cells of our pancreas. Now, insulin goes into the bloodstream and then connects to and opens up glucose channels on the cell membranes of our cells. So that glucose can then, go from the bloodstream and into the cells to be used by the cells as fuel for energy production. And when that happens, the concentration of glucose in the bloodstream decreases, that is, the blood glucose levels decrease. And now, what we talked about last time, most of our cells are able to use both glucose and fatty acids as fuel for energy production, but glucose is the cell's preferred fuel, as glucose oxidation is a more efficient process, or a cleaner process, you could say, of energy production than fatty acid oxidation. And we introduced this in the first episode of this podcast. So if you haven't listened to that one already, I suggest that you go back and do that. That is, in the context of cellular energy production, glucose oxidation is generally a more efficient process than fatty acid oxidation, particularly in terms of oxygen use and also the speed at which ATP, that is usable energy, is generated. But also because glucose oxidation generates less amounts of reactive oxygen species, or ROS, as a byproduct than what happens in fatty acid oxidation. And in increased amounts, ROS is damaging to our cells and to the mitochondria in our cells, the powerhouses of our cells. Now, glucose is transported to our body cells via the bloodstream, so the blood glucose level or blood sugar level or blood glucose concentration is therefore a measure of how much fuel we have available for immediate use. And the blood glucose level is tightly regulated as a part of a metabolic homeostasis or balance. Now, like I just said, most of our body cells can use both glucose and fatty acids as fuel for energy production, but some cells, like neural cells in our brain and nervous system, can only use glucose as fuel, and ketones for that matter, but that's a topic for another episode, and we'll get to that later in this podcast. Now, our brain is the most energy demanding organ and uses approximately 60% of available glucose in the blood in sedentary individuals. So because our brain is a critical organ for the function and survival of our whole body, it is crucial to maintain adequate levels of available glucose at all times in the bloodstream. And in the previous episode, we talked about the hormones that are implicated in blood glucose regulation. That is, blood glucose levels are kept at a balanced range of about 4.4 to 6.1 millimoles per liter, or 79 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. Or at least according to the National Institutes of Health, normal non-fasting blood glucose levels are considered to be below 6.9 millimoles per liter, or 125 milligrams per deciliter. And a healthy fasting blood glucose level is between 4.0 and 5.4, or 70 to 99 milligrams per deciliter. And when blood glucose levels increase, for example, after we've had a meal with carbohydrates, the hormone insulin is secreted from the beta cells of our pancreas and into our bloodstream, and insulin then connects to and opens up glucose channels in the cells so that glucose can then flow from the bloodstream and into the cells to be used as fuel for energy production in the cell. And as a result of that, blood glucose levels or concentration then goes down again. But when the blood glucose level falls, then the hormone glucagon is secreted from alpha cells in the pancreas, and glucagon acts to increase the blood glucose levels again, primarily by stimulating the breakdown of glycogen in liver cells into glucose, which is a process called glycogenolysis, in other words, glycogen breakdown. And remember, glycogen is the storage form of glucose in our body. And also by the formation of glucose from other non-carbohydrate substrates, such as amino acids from proteins, which is a process called gluconeogenesis, in other words, glucose new formation. So insulin is secreted in response to increased concentration of glucose in the blood and then causes a decrease in blood glucose levels, while glucagon does the opposite. It is secreted when blood glucose concentration decreases and causes an increase again in blood glucose levels. Now, in addition to glucagon, there are the stress hormones cortisol and adrenaline, which are also released during a state of low blood glucose levels. And this is important to understand. That is that low concentration of glucose in the blood is a metabolically stressful state. It is metabolic stress. That is, these hormones are generally known as stress hormones, and they are released by the adrenal glands during any kind of stress, whether it's physical stress, emotional stress, or metabolic stress, like hypoglycemia. That is the state of low blood glucose concentration. But both cortisol and adrenaline then work to increase blood glucose levels. Cortisol increases blood glucose levels by enhancing gluconeogenesis, the formation of new glucose molecules, and by decreasing the sensitivity of peripheral tissues to insulin, meaning it makes the body cells less sensitive to insulin so that the glucose channels on the cells don't open up as easily, and then less glucose is therefore taken up from the bloodstream and into the cells. Now, adrenaline increases glucose levels by stimulating glycogenolysis, the breakdown of glycogen in liver cells into glucose, and by promoting also lipolysis, the breakdown of lipids or fats, specifically triglycerides, which is stored in fat cells, breakdown into glycerol and free fatty acids, that is then released into the bloodstream and can be used by many cells as fuel for energy production instead of glucose, and therefore sparing the glucose for the most important tissues. And adrenaline also decreases the secretion of insulin from the pancreas. So basically, that's a rough recap of what we've talked about in the previous episode and where we are right now. Now, regarding blood glucose levels and insulin sensitivity, we need to get technical here again so that we understand this fully, because only when we really understand how our body functions on the most basic level, that's when we are much more likely to understand what is good for our body and what promotes our health and what is not so good for our body maybe and we should stay away from. So first, we need to talk about diabetes before we begin here, because so diabetes mellitus is a condition that is characterized by high blood sugar level or hyperglycemia and decreased or absent insulin activity. And there are two types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease that is caused by the destruction of the beta cells in the pancreas, the cells that create and secrete insulin. And the immune system destroys these cells for some reason, so insulin can no longer be synthesized or secreted into the blood, and therefore glucose molecules that are circulating in the bloodstream cannot be moved into the cells, taken up into the cells. So the blood glucose levels remain high. So people with type 1 diabetes need insulin replacement, so that they need to inject insulin into their body several times a day to be able to get the glucose to transport from the bloodstream and to be used by their cells for energy production. Now, type 1 diabetes is typically diagnosed in children and young adults, but it can also occur. It can occur at any age, though. On the other hand, type 2 diabetes is a form of diabetes that is characterized by high blood glucose levels, insulin resistance, and a relative lack of insulin. So there is some destruction of the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas, but not as extensive as in type 1 diabetes, and it is not due to an autoimmune process. But the most important factor of the development of type 2 diabetes is the insulin resistance. So this type is characterized by insulin resistance, where the body's cells do not respond properly to insulin anymore. And eventually the pancreas may also fail to produce enough insulin. So type 2 diabetes is more commonly diagnosed in people that are adults, but it is sadly increasingly seen in younger populations today due to, for example, rising obesity rates. So essentially, type 1 diabetes is often considered an autoimmune disease appearing early in life and requires insulin for management, while type 2 diabetes typically appears in adulthood and it is more associated with lifestyle factors and is characterized by insulin resistance. Now, that brings us to insulin resistance. What is that exactly? I bet you've heard of it many times before, but maybe we don't understand fully what it is. So insulin, like we've talked about, is the hormone that enables glucose molecules to go from the bloodstream and into the cells, for the cells to use glucose as fuel for energy production, and thus the blood glucose level decreases when the glucose is transported out of the blood and into the cells. And insulin is secreted from the pancreas in response to increased blood glucose concentration following, for example, a carbohydrate meal. And in a person with insulin resistance, his or her body needs more amount of insulin to transport the glucose into the cells. That is, when the cells in his or her body are more resistant to insulin, more amount of insulin is required to open up the glucose channels on the surface of the cells. Now, there's not a one single thing that causes insulin resistance, that makes the cells become more insulin resistant, and the underlying process is actually still not completely understood, but there are many well-known risk factors for this. Now, the development of insulin resistance is often described maybe in a way that makes a lot of sense. That is, that it all stems from a high carbohydrate diet. That a diet high in carbohydrates throughout life leads to constant blood glucose spikes and high blood glucose levels throughout the entire life, which means that the body has had to be constantly producing insulin to lower blood glucose levels. So it has been used to having high insulin levels all the time, and having a lot of circulating insulin in the blood all the time has led to the cells that are supposed to respond to the insulin and take up glucose from the blood, that they have become less reactive to it. Kind of like crying wolf. the body has been crying wolf, quote unquote, for so long with all the insulin throughout life that the cells stop listening to it and don't react to it as well as they are supposed to and are used to. And then our body responds to that by secreting more and more insulin to make the cells listen and respond, and to take up the glucose from the blood, to lower the blood glucose levels and keep it stable. But at some point, the body then just can't produce and secrete enough insulin, so the blood glucose levels remain elevated. And the reason we reach this tipping point is said to be both because the cells become more and more insulin resistant to insulin or immune to insulin, and also because the body can't produce enough insulin because the insulin production is somewhat destroyed. Now, this explanation makes a lot of sense, but if we think about it from an energetic point of view, from the energy production point of view, from the cell's point of view, why would the cells actually do this? Stop responding to insulin like that. Because their reaction or their reason to take up glucose is not in order to lower blood glucose levels. It's not in order to do the blood a favor and lower the blood glucose concentration, but it's for their own favor to use glucose as fuel so that they themselves can produce energy or ATP, so that they themselves can stay alive and function properly. So the cells want to take up the glucose so that they can use it for fuel, so that they can produce energy in the most efficient way to function and stay alive, basically. Because glucose is their preferred energy source, like we've talked about. So why would the cells become more and more difficult and stop responding to the thing that brings them their much desired fuel, their best energy source? Why do they become more reluctant to answer to the thing that transports glucose to them when all they want is the best fuel to produce energy? Would they simply just stop responding to insulin, the thing that brings them their fuel, simply because there's just been so much insulin around all the time? So they become numb to it, like a difficult teenager, denying to listen to his or her parents for some rebellious reasons. When you think about it, it doesn't make sense from the energetic point of view. And it is actually not that simple. So why do the cells then refuse to take up the glucose that the insulin is trying to make them take up? So firstly, there are two types of insulin resistance. Number one, we have adaptive insulin resistance or physiological insulin resistance. And then number two, we have pathological insulin resistance. Now, in individuals that are insulin resistant and have pre-diabetes or people that are already have type 2 diabetes, we're talking about pathological insulin resistance. So the elevated blood glucose levels and the elevated levels of insulin and the fact that the cells are not responding to insulin are simply symptoms of an underlying problem. But it's not actually what's causing the problem. And I'll say this again. The elevated blood glucose levels and the elevated levels of insulin and the fact that the cells are not responding to insulin in pathological insulin resistance, these are simply symptoms of an underlying problem, but it's not actually what's causing the problem. And in order to understand this, we must look inside the cell a little bit closer. Okay. Now, I told you that we would get technical here, and if you're listening to this episode on YouTube and watching the video, you can look at the picture that I have up here, as it is always easier to understand things better when we can envision it, see it visually. But if you're only listening, I'll explain this slowly and as simply as I can. Okay, now this is a picture of cellular respiration, that is all the steps in the oxidation process of glucose inside a cell. That is the process of producing usable energy or ATP for the cell to run on. Now, this is all inside a cell, and this right here is one mitochondria inside the cell. So we're looking at what happens inside the cell and then inside the mitochondria in the energy production process. So under normal circumstances, when a glucose molecule enters a cell, it undergoes a process called glycolysis, or the breakdown of glucose. That is, glucose is broken down inside the cell, and in that process, 2 ATP units or usable energy units are produced. But the final substrate of this process, which is called pyruvate, that we see down here, and pyruvate is then transported into the mitochondria of the cell, and inside the mitochondria, pyruvate then enters a process called Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and then intermediates from this process go into another process called the electron transport chain. And this process happens at or in the lipid membrane, the inner mitochondrial membrane. You see it here. And this process produces even more ATP, that is usable energy. Now, there are a lot of steps in this process, and under certain circumstances, we can get an issue with this energy production process. With using glucose in this process, we can get a problem with glucose oxidation. And when that happens, we get a buildup of intermediates. And instead of being used for energy production in this normal way, the glucose then gets converted to lactate instead of pyruvate. So instead of pyruvate, then going into the mitochondria, because there's a buildup of intermediates here, so we cannot use the glucose or use the pyruvate from the glycolysis process for this energy production process. So the cell decides to rather convert glucose into lactate. So when glucose has been then converted to lactate, we create some amount of energy or ATP through that process, but not nearly enough. So the cell is therefore forced to rely on another type of fuel, on fatty acid oxidation for the main energy production process. So ultimately, for some reason, there's an issue at the electron transport chain, which is the final step of ATP production in the mitochondria and the final step of energy production, the process that happens in the membrane of the mitochondria. And because of these issues, we can then get a buildup of intermediates from the breakdown of glucose inside the cell, that is of pyruvate, and the cell can't use pyruvate for ATP production because of the underlying problem, so it can't use that to make ATP. So the cell then rather converts glucose to lactate instead of pyruvate, which is a backup mechanism to help with ATP production. But this process is not as effective and efficient and leads to buildup of glucose within the cell and not enough ATP production. Now, the cell needs to produce ATP to produce enough energy, and it needs to do that more efficiently. And if there's an issue with using glucose as a fuel for that energy production process, an issue with glucose oxidation, then the cell turns to fatty acids as a fuel and starts running on fatty acid oxidation instead of glucose oxidation. So in this case, the cell is breaking down all the glucose that it does have inside itself to lactate to produce some amount of energy, but that only produces a small amount of ATP, and it is a slow and inefficient way of producing energy. So the cell uses another type of fuel to run the most effective process on, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. That is it uses then mainly fatty acids. But as the breakdown of glucose to lactate is a slow and inefficient way to use the glucose that the cell has, the cell then can't use all the glucose it gets in as fast as and as well as it's used to. So eventually we get a buildup of glucose within the cell. We get more buildup of glucose that the cell can't use. Now, both the buildup of glucose within the cell and the fact that the cell is running cellular respiration, that is, the cell is running the main energy production process on fatty acids, both of these factors make the cell resistant to getting more glucose in, making the cell more resistant to respond to insulin. Now, all of this is not ideal. It is not as efficient, and it does come at a cost due to increased production of ROS or reactive oxygen species, because when fatty acids are utilized for oxidation for energy production, the production of reactive oxygen species is also increased. And this can have many bad effects, but in regards to energy production, ROS have detrimental effects on the mitochondria itself, affecting their energy production at the electron transport chain, and it further blocks the usage and further uptake of glucose as well. So when the cell is mainly running on fatty acid oxidation, we get increased production of ROS, which is damaging to the mitochondria and to the cell itself, damaging the energy production process further, and so on. Now, in addition to that, when the cell runs on fatty acid oxidation for producing energy, it leads to an imbalance in specific intermediates in these processes here. And this imbalance leads to an impaired ability to use intermediates that come from glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose. That is a further inability to use pyruvate for the energy production process in the Krebs cycle. And because the intermediates from the glucose breakdown process, that is pyruvate, can't be used effectively in energy production, then fatty acids or ketones or alcohol for that matter are used instead. And the fact that the fatty acids are used instead then also further blocks the usage of the intermediates from the glucose breakdown process. So as the cell realizes that the glucose it has can't be used effectively for producing energy, it stops using the glucose and turns to fatty acids. So the glucose then builds up inside the cell. And these two factors then together lead to the cell becoming more immune to insulin, more resistant to insulin. So under normal circumstances, when insulin binds to an insulin receptor on a cell, the glucose channels open up and glucose can enter the cell. But when a cell is resistant to insulin, it doesn't open up the glucose channels, even though insulin is bound to the receptor. So that is, the cell becomes resistant to insulin because A, there's a buildup of glucose inside the cell, which the cell then can't use efficiently. So the cell is saying, no, stop, I don't need more glucose in here, I have enough. I have more than I can use actually. So the cell refuses to respond to the insulin that is trying to transport glucose from the blood and into the cell. And B, the cell has also become more resistant to insulin because of the fact that fatty acids are being used as the primary fuel. And that in itself also inhibits further uptake of glucose into the cell. And this is a process or an effect that's called the Randle effect or Randle cycle. So basically, when the cell is running on fatty acid oxidation to produce its energy, it blocks the uptake of glucose and also causes a further buildup of glucose inside the cell. And the buildup of glucose inside the cell also blocks further glucose uptake and so forth. I've explained this now in many circles. So what's actually going on here is that for some reason the mitochondria within the cell can't oxidize glucose effectively. So they turn to fatty acids as a fuel instead, and this blocks further uptake of glucose into the cell as well. And then what is also happening as a result of the cell's inability to oxidize glucose is that there is a buildup of glucose and its intermediates within the cell. And this will also block further uptake of glucose into the cell. So these two factors then cause two things. Number one, an impairment in the cell's response to insulin. And number two, an increase in blood glucose levels because the glucose can't get inside the cells. Now, this association between impaired mitochondrial oxidative capacity and insulin resistance has been confirmed in several studies that have reported an impairment in mitochondrial function in individuals with type 2 diabetes. So mitochondrial dysfunction is proposed by many studies to be the underlying defect in the pathogenesis of insulin resistance, that is, of pathological insulin resistance. And this is very important to understand in order to both prevent the development of insulin resistance and to fix it. This right here, what we've talked about up until now, is pathological insulin resistance. But like I said earlier, we also have adaptive insulin resistance. That is, adaptive insulin resistance is a physiological evolutionary process that serves a purpose in regards to survival. So our body is, under normal or healthy circumstances, able to adjust the insulin sensitivity of different tissues in response to its environment. That is, our body is able to turn up or turn down the cell's response to insulin, depending on its own environment. That is, depending on how much food or fuel we're getting in our body on a regular basis, and what types of nutrients, what types of food, what types of nutrients that we get from this food. Now, this adaptive mechanism may not always be ideal, but this is what happens, for example, during fasting, on low-carb diets, during starvation, and so forth. So it's a clever system, but like I said, it's not always ideal. And I'll explain this. So during fasting, we want to preserve as much glucose as possible for the most sensitive and important tissues like the brain. And under these circumstances, we don't want our muscles, for example, to use up all the glucose that we do have, because they will do that relatively fast. And then we may run out of glucose for the important tissues like the brain. So these tissues then switch to fatty acids as fuel instead of glucose. And they do that by turning down, quote unquote, the response of the cells to insulin. So when a certain type of tissue uses fatty acids as its main fuel source at some given point in time, those cells become more resistant to insulin in order to keep the glucose out of these particular cells, so that the glucose may be partitioned and may be used by other more important cells that need it more. In other words, when cells are using fatty acids as fuel, they don't need glucose, and therefore they shut down or turn down their insulin receptors so that the glucose channels don't open up. And glucose can therefore rather be taken up and used by other tissues that need it more, like the brain. So insulin resistance in this case is an adaptive mechanism in response to the body's environment to partition the fuel, the most important fuel, the glucose, to different tissues. And then the fact that the cell is using fatty acid oxidation, then that then further promotes the usage of fatty acids as a fuel source, as an energy source, as fuel, which also contributes to this state of insulin resistance. And this is actually well known in people who are, for example, on keto diets. They become very glucose intolerant because they are in an insulin resistant state, because their body has adapted to the environment of not getting any or extremely little glucose in through the diet. So it relies on creating glucose by itself through, for example, gluconeogenesis in the liver from non-carbohydrate sources like amino acids from protein, for the brain to use. Because like we've talked about, neural cells are not able to use fatty acids as fuel. And then the body also turns to the production of ketones, because the body can't produce glucose fast enough for as long enough for these important tissues. So they start using ketones as well. But we'll get to that in more detail in a later episode. But because there's so little glucose available in a body that is in this state, all of that glucose is spared for the most important tissues, like neural cells in the brain and nervous system. So to make sure that other cells like the muscle cells don't take up and use up that glucose that is available in the blood and is on its way to the neural cells. So those cells are made insulin resistant. So this adaptive mechanism of insulin resistance can be fixed or reverted quite easily by slowly introducing carbohydrates back to the diet, or, by starting to eat again after a night's fast, for example. But even though this adaptive mechanism is clever, it is not always ideal, because running on fatty acid oxidation has its own problems and challenges at the mitochondrial level. Because during fatty acid oxidation, like we've talked about, we also get increased production of ROS, or reactive oxygen species, compared to during glucose oxidation, which in itself leads to oxidative damage to the mitochondrial DNA and can therefore directly induce insulin resistance. That is, too much of it can damage the mitochondrial DNA, which leads to damage to the mitochondrial function, which is to produce energy. So to explain this in even more detail for those who need that in order to fully accept this, myself in the beginning when I was starting my journey, here's why the mitochondria might preferentially oxidize fatty acids instead of glucose. And this was something that irritated me for a while. That is, how come that if there's some problem with the energy production process in the mitochondria, how come that they're then able to oxidize fatty acids to produce energy, but not glucose? And like so many things regarding our bodies, there's not one single reason for this. So when the energy production process of the mitochondria in the cells becomes compromised because of, for example, increased oxidative damage, for example, due to excessive reactive oxygen species production from increased or prolonged fatty acid production or oxidation, then there are a few factors that affect or influence how the mitochondria may preferentially oxidize fatty acids in this state. Number one is because of increased lipolysis. That is, normally, insulin, the hormone insulin, inhibits lipolysis or the breakdown of fats. But in states of insulin resistance, that means that the insulin action is impaired. So the breakdown of fats is not adequately suppressed. So fats are broken down to a larger degree, and this leads to increased concentrations of free fatty acids in the bloodstream. And when there are high levels of free fatty acids in the bloodstream, then more fatty acids are taken up into the cells and directed towards the mitochondria for oxidation. Number two, the second factor that affects why the cells rather turn to usage of fatty acids when the energy production process is defected is due to compensatory mechanisms. That is, as mitochondrial efficiency in glucose oxidation decreases due to damage, such as from ROS, the cells then may rely more on fatty acids as an energy source, as an alternative to glucose, because fatty acids can enter the cells and the mitochondria independently of insulin, which makes them a more reliable source of fuel under insulin-resistant conditions. Now, the third factor is adaptive preference. That is, the mitochondria adapt to utilize fatty acids more due to the constant high availability of these molecules, and because the process of fatty acid oxidation actually generates more ATP units per molecule of substrate than glucose, but at the cost of producing more reactive oxygen species. Now, even though this may be an adaptive response, this does, however, only exacerbate the oxidative stress because of even more ROS production. Now, the fourth factor is feedback inhibition. That is, high levels of fatty acids and their metabolites in the cells and mitochondria in the cells can inhibit some key enzymes in the glucose oxidation pathway. For example, during fatty acid oxidation, there is accumulation of acetyl-CoA from beta oxidation, which inhibits an enzyme in the glucose oxidation pathway called pyruvate dehydrogenase. And the role of this enzyme is to convert pyruvate, which is, as you maybe remember, the final substrate from the breakdown of glucose inside the cell, to acetyl-CoA in glucose metabolism. And this further promotes the shift towards fatty acid oxidation and not glucose oxidation. So all of this together leads to a decreased ability by the cells to use glucose as fuel. So the cell responds to that by becoming more and more resistant to insulin, so that it doesn't take up more glucose because it cannot use it that well. That is, this person becomes more and more glucose intolerant. He or she can't use glucose efficiently anymore. And that's not because this person has had too much of glucose in his or her body throughout his or her life, but because of the energy production process at the cellular level has become more and more damaged. So the cells that are able, like muscle cells and liver cells, they rather use fatty acids as fuel because they are better able and encouraged to burn fatty acids in the stressful state. So to sum this up, in pathological insulin resistance, the fatty acid oxidation is the result of some issues with the glucose oxidation process in the mitochondria. There are some problems at the mitochondrial level with using glucose as fuel for energy production, so the cell then turns to fatty acids as fuel. It turns to fatty acid oxidation instead. So there's a lack of glucose oxidation because of an issue in the mitochondria. So fatty acid oxidation is the result of that issue. But in the case of adaptive insulin resistance, fatty acid oxidation is the driver of the lack of glucose oxidation. So based on this, if one wants to fix an insulin-resistant state, avoiding the oxidation of carbs, that is glucose, and focusing on oxidation of fatty acids or trying to upregulate fatty acid oxidation actually does the opposite of what one might attempt to do. That is, it blocks the cell's ability to use carbs or glucose, meaning it makes people more glucose intolerant. And this is well known in people that are on, for example, a low carb or keto diet. If they go ahead and take a glucose tolerance test, they are very insulin resistant in that state because, as we just learned, the utilization of fatty acids as the primary fuel for energy production blocks the utilization of glucose or carbs. So they don't tolerate carbs as well because their cells are very resistant to insulin. Now, the fact that the cells are refusing to answer to insulin and take up glucose from the blood then leads to elevated levels of blood glucose and elevated levels of circulating insulin in the blood. And this right here explains very well why glucose and insulin is elevated in insulin resistance. The glucose molecules can't enter the cells, so the body responds to that by secreting more and more insulin into the bloodstream because it doesn't understand why on earth the cells won't respond to the insulin that's already there and take up the glucose. And this is a factor that is often not discussed as much. That is, what is going on inside the cell that is making the cell refusing to respond to insulin. But instead, there's always a huge focus on what's going on in the bloodstream, the high blood glucose levels and high insulin levels. So a lot of things can be done to treat, quote unquote, the high blood glucose levels and high insulin levels, or hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia. But that doesn't necessarily fix the underlying issue that's causing the high levels of glucose and insulin. And regarding insulin, insulin is often talked about as kind of being the bad guy, which we understand why, because in a lot of diseases you see increased levels of insulin, but insulin isn't the driver of the disease. It's merely a symptom or a sign of an underlying problem. And when we see that, we should focus on trying to figure out and fix the underlying problem and not merely focus on avoiding glucose and force the glucose that's in the blood into the cells, for example, by taking medications, for example, that increase insulin sensitivity. That only increases the amount of glucose inside the cell, which has troubles using it. We need to try to fix the problem with glucose utilization, with the underlying problem with glucose oxidation. Now, okay, so there are two things about fatty acid oxidation. Number one, it blocks glucose oxidation, blocks further uptake of glucose from the bloodstream and into the cells. And number two, it leads to increased production of ROS, which is in the long run damaging for the cell and for the mitochondria inside the cell. And the increase in ROS is often referred to as oxidative stress. And there can be other causes of increase of ROS and oxidative stress, such as radiation, heavy metals, endotoxins, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and more. But the oxidation of fatty acids on a cellular level for energy production is a really big factor here. Now, another thing regarding when cells are running on fatty acid oxidation is that it is a much less efficient process of producing energy. And when our body's cells are not producing energy efficiently enough for a prolonged period of time, our body then interprets that as an energy deficient state, which is a metabolically stressful state. And when our body is in an energy deficient state like that, it responds to that by upregulating stress hormones to maintain ATP production or energy production and to maintain high blood glucose levels. So this is a stressful state. Now, I'll sum up a little bit here. The most common understanding of what's going on in insulin resistance, in metabolic dysfunction, is that the cells are immune to insulin or resistant to respond to insulin, so glucose can't enter the cells from the bloodstream, leading to elevated blood glucose levels, elevated levels of insulin in the blood as well, because the body is trying to get the cells to respond, and a lack of glucose within the cell. But that's only partially true, because there's actually not a lack of glucose within the cell, but there's an issue with utilizing glucose in the cell. So our body interprets that as lack of energy. It thinks that there's a lack of glucose within its cells. It thinks that the cells need more glucose because there's high amounts of it in the bloodstream, and it's sensing a lack of energy in the cells. But what's actually happening is that there is not a lack of glucose within the cells, but some dysfunction in the cell's ability to oxidize or utilize glucose for energy production, to use it as fuel. And this process is for some reason defected, so the cell turns to fatty acids as fuel, as an energy source instead of glucose. And both of these things, that is the fact that the cell is running on fatty acids and the fact that the cell is unable to use the glucose it has as its main fuel, this leads to accumulation of glucose within the cell, and this accumulation of glucose within the cell and the fatty acid oxidation process both make the cell more insulin resistant in order to stop insulin from bringing more glucose into the cell, because the cell already has more glucose than it can use at this point. But again, the body sees it like this. My cells are not using glucose for energy production, so I am in an energy deficient state. This is stressful, and my cells are lacking glucose. I must therefore do everything I can to increase glucose availability, to increase the glucose concentration in the blood, that is, upregulate stress hormones so that glucose will be released from storage and produced from other sources, and paradoxically, quote unquote, makes peripheral tissues more resistant to insulin to spare the glucose in order to increase the blood glucose concentration. And then, in addition, I need to force the glucose into the cells. So I'll produce more and more insulin to force the cells to open up their glucose channels. So that's essentially why the blood glucose concentration goes up and insulin levels also go up, because the pancreas only responds to the hyperglycemia, the high blood glucose levels. And when the blood glucose levels are high, the pancreas secretes more and more insulin to try to get the glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cells. And in addition to this, being in a low energy state like this is a metabolic stress. This is metabolically stressful, which leads to the stress hormones, glucagon, cortisol, and adrenaline, to be released in order to keep blood glucose levels high so that the most important tissues have good access to this fuel. So these hormones are released despite the blood glucose levels being high, because the body is in a metabolically stressful state, an energy deficient state. And this may sound paradoxical to some that think that, to someone who thinks about this without looking at this from an energetic point of view. And these stress hormones also mobilize fatty acids from the body stores, the body fat, to be released as free fatty acids into the bloodstream so that there's at least enough fatty acids available at all times for the cells that are able to use fatty acids to take up. So the cells that are now relying heavily on fatty acid oxidation for energy production so that they have enough to take up. And this is how we have elevated blood glucose levels, elevated insulin levels, and elevated levels of the stress hormones all at the same time in insulin resistance, along with also elevated levels of free fatty acids and triglycerides in the blood. So ultimately, these changes create a vicious cycle where insulin resistance leads to higher levels of blood glucose and lipids, which in turn further worsen insulin sensitivity and overall metabolic health. Now, regarding the stress hormones, the levels of stress hormones increase and upregulate fatty acid oxidation within the cell in this state. And the stress hormones also stimulate and increase the secretion of free fatty acids into the bloodstream, which further supports the usage of fatty acids for producing energy in the cells and prevents the cells from taking up glucose. And these hormones also stimulate glucose production in the liver because, as we've learned earlier, these stress hormones are also released when blood glucose levels are low, a stressful state, as it signals to the body that there is scarcity of energy supply. So in that case, the stress hormone's job is to increase blood glucose levels. And this is often seen in people with insulin resistance when their fasting blood glucose levels increases. That is because the stress hormones stimulate the liver to produce more glucose in this stressful situation. And many people see this when they are on a low-carb diet or keto diet, that their fasting blood glucose levels increase. And then they don't understand why, because they're not eating any carbs. But this is where the glucose is coming from. That is from the increased glucose production in the liver as a result of the effects of the stress hormones. And together, all of these things further drive insulin resistance in the cells, blocks the uptake and usage of glucose, and increases the symptoms of insulin resistance even further. That is, they increase the blood sugar response to any carbohydrate intake, any carbohydrate meal, and they also increase the fasting blood glucose levels and insulin levels. Because when there is increased levels of glucose in the blood due to problems with using it in the cell, it requires higher amount of insulin to drive the glucose into the cells and to decrease the stress hormones, which is one important role of insulin. That is, to decrease stress hormones in order to decrease free fatty acids in the bloodstream, in order to downregulate the usage of fatty acids for oxidation, because insulin is trying to get the cell to use glucose instead of fatty acids as fuel, and to reduce the glucose production in the liver. Because insulin wants to lower the blood glucose levels, it wants to get the glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cells and stop the liver from producing more glucose to release into the bloodstream. So insulin and stress hormones counteract one another. So the insulin here is helpful. It is not the bad guy, actually, because it lowers free fatty acids, it lowers glucagon and the glucose production in the liver, and it lowers the stress responses and effects of the stress hormones, lowering the cell's fatty acid oxidation to help the cells use glucose instead and take up more glucose from the bloodstream, even though it maybe doesn't fully help with the underlying problem of the glucose oxidation process. That really depends on the person's state. If the person is in a diabetic state, it doesn't necessarily help with improving the glucose oxidation. But if you're a person who is not diabetic, but you're in a low-carb state, it will help you improve the glucose oxidation by lowering the fatty acid oxidation. And this is really important because insulin is often talked about as being the bad guy. You know, that it's insulin that's driving obesity, driving diabetes and other health problems, while insulin actually is just the messenger of the underlying problem, a messenger that is responding to the underlying problem and trying to fix it the best it can. So in these states, that is in insulin-resistant states, increasing glucose availability by eating carbohydrates in our diet causes also an increase in insulin, leading to a reduction in the stress hormones, reducing the stress-driven state, and together this signals to the body that the environment is not stressful, as it's getting the signal that there are abundant energy sources and the stress levels are lower. So this is helpful, although it may not fix all of the underlying issues with the glucose oxidation, but at least it helps in that direction through ways that I've said over and over again by now, by decreasing fatty acid oxidation, decreasing ROS production, decreasing stress levels, and so on. So often increasing carbohydrate intake in a person that is in an insulin-resistant state, and also for a person who has type 2 diabetes, that can actually help with insulin sensitivity, that is making you more insulin sensitive and therefore more glucose tolerant, given that it's done correctly and with the right food. But just to finish this off a little bit here, what is it that causes the initial issue with the energy production process at the electron transport chain, for example? So when the underlying problem of insulin resistance is an issue with utilizing glucose and converting it to energy, the solution is to fix that. And that process is affected by actually everything in our environment. It is affected by the macronutrients in our diet and the balance there. It is also affected by the types of foods that are coming in and their micronutrients. It is affected by our gut health, where one of the main things that interferes with glucose oxidation is endotoxins, which are toxic substrates that are released by certain gut bacteria when they break down. And we'll talk about this later in an episode on gut health. And it is also affected by a number of other factors as well, like blood glucose levels, like we've talked about in great detail in this episode. It is affected by polyunsaturated fatty acids from our diet. It is affected by stress, physical and psychological. It is affected by sleep quality. It is affected by movement, that is, living a sedentary lifestyle affects glucose oxidation negatively. Vitamins, that is, lack of some vitamins may affect the glucose oxidation process. Toxic compounds that get into our body through everything from our food, such as additives, preservatives, artificial ingredients, and pesticides, to chemicals from household cleaning products, cosmetics and creams, plastic containers, heavy metals, and so forth, and so much more regarding our overall lifestyle. So fixing the cell's capacity for energy production is essentially what fixes insulin resistance and prevents it from developing. And obviously, this is a complex matter, but if we get the foundation right here with our diet, with blood glucose balance, sleep, lowering stress, focusing on gut health, getting enough sunlight, reducing exposure to toxic compounds, and so forth, that is the general starting point. But the diet is absolutely the most important factor to start with. There are, however, some specifics that are important to address, but the foundation is our diet. Making sure that we get the right amount of macronutrients, the right amount of calories, the right amount of micronutrients, and avoiding certain excesses of micronutrients, for example. And then implementing, regular movement is another very important factor, especially, for example, going out for a walk after a meal. That helps with increasing insulin sensitivity. That is, making the cells in our peripheral tissues, like the muscle tissues, become more sensitive to insulin, so they respond to it better and are better able to take up glucose from the blood after a meal. Now, another thing is the hormonal side. Checking for thyroid function can help, testosterone levels for men. And then for women of reproductive age, the menstrual cycle is actually a huge indicator of the body's hormonal balance. So if you're having irregular menstrual cycles, that may be a sign of an underlying metabolic problem. And this is all important because all our hormones affect one another and how the cells in the different tissues in our bodies react and operate. So an imbalance in hormones can greatly affect our cells' ability to use glucose and prevent effective glucose oxidation. So the point of all of this is that I really want you to understand is that carbohydrates are not the enemy. The goal is not to avoid carbs or avoid fat or never have an increase in blood glucose levels after a meal or anything like that. The goal is to provide the body with the best fuel available to create energy and the fuel it functions best on, but in the right way and the right amount, along with the right amount of the other macronutrients and essential micronutrients, so that the body tolerates the usage of carbohydrates, reducing stress levels and utilizing glucose efficiently. And it's not just about having the amount of carbohydrates that you only tolerate, it's about improving the underlying problems and issues that make the body intolerant to carbohydrates because of the cell's increased resistance to insulin. Thanks for tuning into this episode. If you're looking for more information or want to check out any studies I reference, head on to my website, babyletsmove.com. You can also join me for a workout through my app called Baby Let's Move, available in both App Store and Google Play. And don't forget to connect with me on Instagram and YouTube for even more content. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider giving it a 5-star rating or a like and share it with a friend. It really helps me reach more amazing listeners like you. Until next time, keep moving and stay healthy.